Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the first of the series of three in a virtual dialogue on climate resilient food systems from Africa. Today and in the following sessions, we will dive into climate resilient food systems and find evidence and action. I will be introducing the three series of webinars, and after that we just dive into the dialogue. My name is Ivo Demmers. I work at Wageningen University in research as a manager of the Food Security and Value in Water Research Program. In these series of three webinars, we will continue on what the Global Commission on Adaptation called as a needed revolution in understanding, planning and finance to tackle climate resilience and adaptation in Africa. Together with the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture and food security, Wageningen University, and the ministries, Dutch ministries on foreign affairs and agriculture, nature and food quality put together these three series of webinars. And this is the first one. Why now? 2021 is an important year in this transformation process, as we will have on the 25th of January the Climate Adaptation Summit taking place. These three webinars will directly feed into the Climate Adaptation Summit. But there's more. There's the Biodiversity Summit mid-21, and later this year we have the United Nations Food Systems Summit, followed by the COP26. The results of the three webinars will be fed in those events as well. So this is important. And it's important not to be business as usual. So with the series of three webinars, we try to be provocative and do things differently. Today, we will focus on understanding how evidence interacts with planning, financing, and action on the ground, and find innovative ways. Before I hand the floor over to our chair of today, I would like to thank all speakers and all partners who helped to put this impressive lineup of speakers and programs together. Now I would like to hand over the floor to Rachel Lambert, Senior Livelihoods Advisor within the Agricultural Research Department at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the United Kingdom. Rachel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivo, and thank you all for joining us today. We've heard from many experts and we've had many reports in the last few years that set out the need for a real transformation in agriculture and food systems if we're to achieve the Paris goals on climate change, restore the environment, whilst also delivering on SDGs on hunger and nutrition, and delivering better livelihoods and economic opportunities for poor people. As we heard at the Race to Zero events late last year, food systems are at the core of action on interconnected issues like equity, resilience, soil health, biodiversity, nutritious and healthy diets. And delivering this transformation of agriculture and food systems will require sustained investments in new evidence, new practices and improved technologies. We know that advances in science have driven huge changes in agriculture in the past, and they will be needed to continue to make those significant changes. Today's session is a real opportunity to distill messages about the role of science and innovation and feed this into the Africa session at the Climate Adaptation Summit. How can we ensure that our research investments deliver that transformation and at the necessary pace and scale? How can we ensure that evidence translates into better outcomes both for climate as well as for smallholder farmers, for rural men and women, and for those who don't have access to healthy diets? It's because of the importance of investing in innovation, whether that be new practices or technologies or ways of taking them to scale, that the UK's COP presidency and the Nature campaign includes an emphasis on actions to transform agriculture innovation for climate, nature and people. And we in FCDO's Agriculture Research Team are delighted to be co-chairing this campaign with the CGIAR's CAS programme. Later this month at the Climate Adaptation Summit, we'll be launching this campaign, and inviting you and others to join us in mobilising pledges and initiatives in an agenda which connects the Race to Zero with the Biodiversity COP, the UN Food Systems Summit, and then the COP in Glasgow and beyond. And there are a number of thrusts to this campaign. Increasing investments in research that's driven by farmers' needs under a changing climate. Realigning public investment in research that supports food, climate and nature. Showcasing what works in taking nature-positive approaches to scale. And developing new approaches, new partnerships, which can scale climate-resilient agriculture practices and technologies. 2021 is a really big year for food systems and climate. We all need to be part of this moment for change, and today's session focuses in on a key ingredient for this transformation, the role of evidence and the role of innovation. We've got a really exciting programme of speakers and panellists. Paul DeSanka of the UNFCCC will kick us off with a presentation on the role of evidence and innovation at a national level in solutions for adaptation, particularly focusing on the national adaptation plans. And then we have a fantastic panel who will share their perspectives on Paul's presentation. Christophe Larose heads up sustainable agriculture in the EEC, and that includes work on innovation, research and digital approaches. Welcome, Christophe. Then we have Thembi Mwamakamba, who's the Director of Policy Research and Analysis at FANRAPAN, and she coordinates their climate-smart agriculture policy work. We're also pleased to have Marcel van Nijnatter, who's the Policy Coordinator in the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality. And then finally, Chris Kieswer is the Executive Director of the Africa 2000 Network, and he'll be drawing on his experience in working in rural community development. After that panel session, we will hear from Eunice Lekoko, who's a nutrition and gender advisor at Wageningen University, and she will offer her reflections on the dialogue as a young professional working in agricultural innovation. And then finally, to wrap up the session and give us some closing remarks, we'll go to Marco Ferroni. Marco is the chair of the CGIAR System Board. So before we kick off proceedings, a little bit of housekeeping. We're really pleased that during this session we'll have a live Q&A where we hope to interact with you, the audience. In order to ask a question and participate in those interactive sessions, you will need to download the Hoover app. You should see some instructions on this slide. To access the app, you will need to enter the email address that you used to register for the event and create a password. If the event doesn't show up automatically, then search for a virtual dialogue series, Climate Resilient Food Systems for Africa, from Evidence to Action. And then click the join button, which you'll find at the bottom of the event description page, and enter the invitation code, CAS Virtual Dialogues. Otherwise, if that doesn't work, request a new code and wait until the organisers approve your requests. So it'd be great to get your questions, and I know that some of them are already coming in through the Hoover app, so look forward to seeing those shortly. So with no further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Paul DeSanka, who's going to kick us off with a presentation on his perspectives on the role of innovation at the national level. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Very glad to be part of this impressive panel. The issue of food security is quite important to many of us, and I personally look forward to the day when we will once and for all solve the global food security problem, especially for Africa. I'm going to use slides so that you can at least follow better most of the things that I'll be going through. I work at the Climate Change Secretariat, and I support the work on NAPS as well as loss and damage. And in particular, we focused a lot of effort in supporting the least developed countries, most of which are in Africa. So before I jump into NAPS, I wanted to start off with 4 case studies about factors that are perhaps important to consider at the national level. So I'm not going to bore you with NAP 101 straight off the bat, but let's consider these 4 case studies and think about what it is that might be important to consider at that national level when we consider how to address issues of food security. This is part of an open NAP case study that we're doing for Malawi. I'll talk about open NAPs much later, hopefully something to look forward to. So first, I'll talk about a case study of Katrina. You remember in 2005, the major Hurricane Katrina in the US. At that time, Japan imports a lot of corn from the US through that region where Katrina hit. So obviously the transportation routes were disrupted, so Japan had to make a very quick switch to import its corn or maize from South Africa. So that, of course, supply demand, the prices and supply went quite high, and maize supply for the SADC region in Southern Africa was, of course, impacted, and the prices went up. Malawi was unable to import and afford food very quickly. So that led to food shortages. So there was a district in Malawi called Chikwawa where some people actually faced famine conditions because of Katrina. So you can see the interconnectedness of major global events down to the local level in ways that perhaps can be overlooked. Some of the lesson from this is also that in order to understand fully what the problem we're trying to solve is, we have to look at the whole system and what it connects to, etc., in order to start to incorporate solutions. Second case study is also about cyclones. This is Cyclone Idai now in 2019 in March. That obviously caused a lot of havoc and damage to housing, crops, etc. in Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe. But soon afterwards, there was another cyclone that also went through, adding to the damage. And the few crops that survived all of that, of course, fell victim to the fall armyworm. And then there were droughts later in the year as a result, obviously, of this huge deluge of moisture from the atmosphere. So the lesson here is that there's a whole series of events that happen in the full cycle of crop production that are quite important. So it's not the major disaster alone that becomes the key focus. We have to look at the series of events and how they interact in order to impact on the system that we're looking at. And some of those factors are not always climate related, so they can be like pests and diseases that have nothing to do with climate change, or can be social political factors as well. And some of those factors are in most cases, regional or global in the way they come about. Third is a case study on how agriculture contributes to GDP and the impacts of drought. And this is based on a World Bank study that was finalized and published in 2015. This is the reference in case you wanted to look it up. There was a very interesting study that showed how drought actually leads to a direct drop in agriculture production and of course, a drop in GDP's contribution from agriculture. So the big dips from 1992 and 1994 are a result of major droughts that happened in that part of the world. So the correlation between GDP and droughts is quite stunning and unexpected, I suppose. So one of the other analysis from that was actually looking at maize yield over time. So this graph shows maize yield per hectare starting from 1980 to 2012. And then the dips obviously correspond to drought events. So you can almost predict that there'll be a drop. And the World Bank study was interested in looking at what are the sort of the underlying trends. So the straight line is basically a regression curve. So that's the extent of the analysis that they attach to this. It's more the long-term trends and so on. I'll come back to this a little later in terms of what else can we derive from evidence like this. I've just expanded the data to go back to the 1960s, as well as to extend it to 2018. You can see that starting from about 1990, that's when things started to get wild, and there's a lot of variation in yields, etc. But also there's a lot of interventions to try to counter the impacts of drought, and you can see the huge spikes and increases in productivity and so forth. So what can we learn from this? It's obvious that from around the 1990 or so, things started to unravel. So climate started to actually change from the previous normal observations, etc. So climate started to change. Of course, government started to respond and implement measures to counter the droughts, etc. So I think it's also quite important to look at what happened, what was implemented soon after a drought. So you can see the huge peak, almost like a positive response compared to previous trends and so forth. So that's quite interesting. What did government implement in order to counter and overcome the impacts of that drought? As well as what perhaps from an ecological point of view, what's interesting is also the sort of the gradual increase in productivity over time that almost maps to what's the agricultural experts call the yield gap. So it can almost indicate the potential for increase in productivity over time. If you see the graph on the left-hand side, the y-axis, that's actually hectograms. That's if you divide by 10, it gives you kilograms per hectare. So productivity in this part of the world is quite low, actually. It used to be 1.3, sometimes 2, but you can increase that to about 2.5 megatons per hectare. If you compare that to a developed world that has a lot of irrigation and inputs, that's almost as high as 8, sometimes 12 megatons per hectare. So it's a huge gap in what is possible. Obviously, we don't expect a country like Malawi to jump from about 1.3 megatons per hectare to 8 or 9 overnight. But at least they can double, triple that quite easily over time with investments. So that provides a way, I think, to analyze what is possible and how can we ensure that investments and so forth allow us to achieve that increase in productivity. So the last case study is about now the efforts that Malawi is taking to actually transform its agriculture to actually become more food secure. So as a background, most of the agriculture is rain-fed with increasing drought and weather. That makes it quite difficult to achieve their projections. And most of the water in the country resides in Lake Malawi. So Lake Malawi is a major water source that government is banking on in order to expand its major irrigation investments. So they have an initiative called the Greenbelt Initiative that is actually starting to produce very positive results. But there's a but. So the but actually points to the nature of the lake and the role that it plays in the country. Lake Malawi is also a major biodiversity hotspot. It has a lot of endemic fish species, the cichlids and so forth. It's almost been referred to as the Galapagos for freshwater fishes in terms of biodiversity studies. So it's quite important from our biodiversity point of view. The lake also flows into the Shire River and generates 98% of the electricity for the country. So you can imagine that an increase in major irrigation demand based on the same lake will actually have an impact on energy for the country. To make matters worse, there's the capital city is about 200 kilometers away from the lake. It's projected to run out of water in about 10 years because of population pressures and increasing droughts and so forth. So they've actually started to build a major pipeline from the lake to supply the city with water. So these are three major demands on the same water that obviously calls for major trade-off analysis in terms of how can we balance the major uses of the water that the country has. So these 4 case studies basically help us understand some of the problems that national decision makers have to grapple with. It's not simply about enabling rural farmers produce more. It's actually a series of problems that can be solved through policy and through trade-offs and then through strategic investments, etc. That's where the NAPs come in to allow countries to look at all these problems in a holistic manner and start to produce solutions that will help the country achieve food security in the long run. It's easy to come up with questions that can be addressed at that level, and I've seen papers that have produced 100 important questions for the agriculture sector. I have a few here, some of the things that countries look at. So for instance, what are the risks to national food security and contribution to the national economy from agriculture, and how is climate change going to impact on those? How can this risk be fully and optimally managed? How do we best address the needs of the most vulnerable? I think at first entry into this, people would associate most vulnerable as the poor, the rural farmers only. But if you look at it, we have learned from COVID that actually it's not simply the elderly that are vulnerable to COVID. Major businesses and so forth are actually quite vulnerable to COVID and so forth. I think same thing for agriculture. I think we do have to look broadly at the evidence as to who is vulnerable to changes on the agriculture from climate change, and then address all of those needs holistically. When will climate change lead to a collapse of key products and processes? It's not enough to say that 20 years from now, the temperature will be 2 degrees warmer, and so we'll produce less food, etc. The policymaker needs to know what is the likelihood of my food system failing and by when, so that they can start to implement solutions and so forth. What are the costs and benefits? It's quite important for our process for countries to be able to estimate how much it will cost to implement solutions and so on. So that can fit into the political process of how much money is needed to be mobilized for adaptation and so on. So what policies will unlock success, both at the national and local level, etc. What incentives and so on. That's where the inputs from different stakeholders comes in and so on. And so on. So we can go on and on about questions that must be addressed. So finally, what is the NAP? The NAP is basically a vehicle for coordinating adaptation activities at the national level that was created through negotiations under the convention in 2010 and 2011. So the guidelines for NAPs were actually very carefully negotiated by all the parties to the convention. So in a truly party-driven bottom-up approach, the support and funding for preparing a NAP and implementing it are obviously also under the convention, embedded within the Green Climate Fund system and so on. So it's one of the instruments that we have under the convention that actually has mandatory funding. So it's an opportunity, I think, to help countries do the right thing. So we have objectives that are basically to reduce vulnerability and facilitate integration of climate change into development planning and so forth. But it's the usual things that you would expect a national plan to try to achieve. What's important, though, is that it does provide a basis for coordinated effort and support, and hopefully a way to ensure that the right things are done for the right reasons. It's quite well mapped to the Paris Agreement objectives for adaptation with the added link to SDGs and also the temperature limit of less than 2 degrees. So it does provide us something to plan against. This is the NAP process. I'm not going to describe the steps, but it's a whole series of standard steps that you would expect in any planning process that countries are following. So it does provide a way for different actors and different researchers and so forth to come in and help the country do the best it can in its planning. This is a summary of where we are. About 20 countries have produced their NAPs and shared those, but everybody else, about 125 of the developing countries, are at various stages of starting and engaging in processes to actually prepare their adaptation plans. There's a lot of activity and a lot of support from different organizations to help countries do this. The way to engage is, of course, to find out who is the climate change focal point in the country and how can you offer it to help them make sure that the agriculture components are as best as they can be. And what are some of the neat things that we're doing here in the Secretariat, along with the expert groups that we support, the ODC expert group, and the Adaptation Committee, and others? We are actively developing frameworks that provide a platform to integrate different hazards, different sectors, and different actors, etc., in what we're calling a NAP SDG iframe that focuses on systems. And I have a diagram in a minute. We're mobilizing different experts to help countries prepare their NAPs through this open initiative called the Open NAP. So we very much like to welcome anybody with capacity to participate to do so. We're very carefully looking at the concept of a risk-based approach for adaptation. That's what the IPCC is recommending now, that we shift towards considering climate risk and how to best address it and address it fully. So that's an area of very active work and thinking. And COVID has obviously disrupted the normal way of working, and in a way it has returned the narrative for adaptation to the countries, and there's a little bit more ownership of what's going on in the countries to the extent that they can't continue to work with the lockdowns and so forth. Plus COVID itself has lessons for risk management that are quite useful to translate to adaptation. Very quickly, this is a diagram of the iframe I was talking about. So the focus is really on the middle circle and the systems themselves, like crop production, nutritional value for distribution, etc. That's where the focus should be, as opposed to worrying about what is the specific hazard that we need to address, whether it's drought, floods, etc., or which sector is involved, which ministry, or which NGO, which actors, and so forth. Because all of these then that just make it super complicated for the country to manage the relationships. So the focus should really be on the system itself, and that will help us define who should be at the table to help develop solutions. Very quickly, this is the PCL framework. So it's if you look at risk, the way risk is typically addressed, you have preemptive actions. That's the PC, the P in the PCL. So you have a lot of investments to actually, before an event happens, that's adaptation, I suppose. So things you implement before something happens. And to supplement that, there are contingency measures like insurance and so forth that help you to transfer some of that risk. And then when the event happens, you actually have to deal with the actual losses and so on. So there's a continuum of effort that's needed, and the way things have been going on at the moment, you can say there are gaps between what's done preemptively versus how actual losses happen. So one of the objectives is how can we optimize addressing that full range of risk to ensure that maybe 10, 20 years from now, there'll be zero additional risk due to climate change. Everything will be managed and handled through one solution or another. So in conclusion, my advice is let's take the time to understand the national level problems and questions that decision makers have to grapple with before jumping in with solutions. The internet is a useful thing, but it's really not the main source of data and information for most developing countries in the LDCs. So let's make sure that we actually are able to collect evidence on the ground that can help supplement and improve the knowledge base. It's an interesting paper by a guy from University College of London that talked about what do you tell a frog in a boiling pot, what it needs to know. You don't really want to tell the frog that, well, maybe when the water boils, the temperature will be 100 degrees. That's not very useful to the frog. The frog needs to know what is the risk of me dying 5 minutes from now. So we must have to translate that probability into time so it knows when to act and how to act. I know that sometimes we get caught up in labels, etc. Everybody's trying to come up with the next buzzword, whether it's smart, innovative, transformative, futuristic, etc., etc. But perhaps we can also focus on what it is that we want to achieve at the end of the day and not get caught up in this competition for the next phrase that will be used. So lastly, let's respond to the demand side and not always be supply driven. And I'll end with a cartoon that talks about an app being delivered to women in Africa that say, we can help you map and monitor key watering points. And the women are worried, well, is that really going to help me carry the water home? Because I know where the water points are. But it's obviously easier to map the water points from an app and so forth and present that as a solution to the people on the ground. So thank you very much. I hope I look forward to the discussion that's going to follow after this.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul, for that great presentation. I really enjoyed that and I learned a lot from it as well. I think it was a really good reminder of the challenges in managing climate risks, in understanding and unpacking those really complicated trade-offs between the environment and climate and between needs around food and nutrition, productivity, etc. I love your lessons there at the end, particularly. I think that key point around listening to the users and those who are going to use this information, use these planning tools, really working on the demand side. So thanks for that. Let's turn to our panelists now and hear their thoughts. I think hopefully we'll have a opportunity for a couple of rounds of questions to our panelists, and then we'll come to you, the audience. Let's start off with Christophe first. Christophe, we've heard from Paul about the needs at the national level for adaptation planning. We've heard that 20 countries, I think, are already sort of quite well advanced there. How do your agriculture research investments in the European Commission seek to respond to those needs?
Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I would like to start with a political context, and clearly in the European Union context, we have put forward an important policy agenda with what is called the European Green Deal, that is now already being translated into a number of policies and responses. That is an ambitious plan for the Commission and the EU member states to jointly tackle challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, sustainable food systems, looking at all the interlinkages and tensions that exist, of course, in when you want to move a transformative agenda in this area. It's certainly very important in the European Union context as a, say, domestic issue, but it will have also very significant implications in terms of global engagement from the European Union and its member states, in trade relationship and in cooperation agenda. If we have to look now at how it will be translated and to link it to the research agenda. Clearly, substantial resources will be allocated to one of our flagship programs, which is Horizon Europe, our research and innovation program for Europe, open to the world, of course. And we know that this program will significantly invest in areas connected to the European Green Deal. So this is the policy response to the political engagement. And I would like to quickly come to the question that you raised, and certainly to develop a bit more in the subsequent intervention, and to mention what we are doing from the agricultural research for development side, which is more in the remit of my Directorate General. First, we try as much as we can to have an approach that is looking at the global, continental, and national level, because issues are certainly interconnected, and we try to balance our investments in different systems and organizations that can interact at these different levels, so global, continental, and national. But if I have to look at what is going to happen in the coming weeks, months, in terms of new priorities for cooperation with partner countries, what will be key is how, in the dialogue with the countries, research and innovation comes in, and how it is prioritized by these countries in their own policies, but also in terms of interest to partner with the European Union, in our case, on this topic. And of course, to connect that to the transformative agenda of food systems and agriculture. We'll also be quite keen to look at what kind of research we are talking about. We are, and it's to make a link with what Paul mentioned in his last slide. But certainly, we value a lot in agricultural research for development the idea of construction of approaches. The role of innovation platforms, the role of diverse actors that have a say, and more than a say, a role in innovation systems, in partnership with research for sure, but not only with research. And what I would like to say also now is a research that is really to help policymakers to make choices. And policymakers, the life of any policymakers is to make trade-off. And to make trade-off, you need to be aware of all the issues and the challenges that you have to face. So it's to allow and facilitate research actions that are looking at the complexity of issues, not to be blocked by this complexity, but to be aware of this complexity, especially if we need to tackle climate change, but also if we need to look at biodiversity loss, and also how we want to provide food systems that are benefiting to the people and not damaging or benefiting to the nature if possible. So this is really what we would like to foster as much as we can, because we think that this is really how research and science can provide elements of decisions for policymakers, whose, as I said, role is to arbitrate among many priorities, many challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Christophe. Great, and yeah, I think those points on the complexity and the trade-offs are so important. Let's come to Tembi. Tembi, Paul outlined the needs of national adaptation decision makers, and I know that FANRAPAN works very closely with agriculture policy makers. Do you see the needs of agriculture policy makers as being substantially different from those of those dealing with adaptation decisions? And how can we make sure that we respond to both sets of needs? How do we align the needs of those different decision makers?
Okay. Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone who is watching. Paul's presentation was quite excellent, and I actually just smiled when he went through his long list of national needs of decision makers. So I found myself grappling with are the decision makers that Paul is talking about different from the agriculture policymakers that we work with. But I think in our work at FANRAPAN, in our work with agriculture policymakers, we have learned that in order to make informed decisions, policymakers need timely and useful information. So yes, they want to know about the possible consequences of climate change, people's perceptions of whether the consequences are positive or are negative. They also want to know what are the available adaptation options and can they afford them. So in my opinion, and also having listened to what Paul outlined as the decision needs of decision makers, I believe that generally the needs of agriculture policymakers are not very different from those of national adaptation decision makers. What is clear is that policymakers who broadly deal with climate change issues need to identify pathways for better policy alignment. In most of our countries, you'll find that climate change issues sit in separate departments or ministries, for instance. So you would have people in the Ministry of Agriculture working on bits of climate change issues. You have people within environment, people within national development planning. But there is need to bring all those efforts together. I think that's where the challenge is. So one approach that shows promise in the region that we have been using as part of our Global Challenges Fund, Research Fund supported AfriCAP program is scenario development and analysis. We have been using this approach to stimulate a systems-based policy identification and prioritization process across multiple interdependent sectors. And this is actually proving to be a good approach to alignment. But of course, because FANRAPAN works at a regional level, while this is working at a national level, there's also need to look at how the national aligns to the regional as well as to the global. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Tembi. Great points there, and good to hear you picking up this issue as well of affordability. And I think Paul also talked about the importance of understanding the cost benefits of different strategies and different options. And I think that's an area where we probably need much more evidence. Marcel, the Netherlands have been a huge advocate for improved evidence in issues around climate and food. What are we missing in the current context? And why are we not seeing sufficient interactions between evidence and policymakers?
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to the organizers for putting this series together. And the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Nature Quality and Foreign Affairs are proud to be part of the organization and to be facilitating this. Thanks for the question. What we are seeing at the moment is basically that from, if you want, the scientific community, from climate change and from biodiversity, they have put outstanding issues on the table. They have made sure that we understand that there is a really need for the agriculture sector to address those issues. They've pointed out, for instance, that the land use problem within the agriculture sector is a contribution, a huge contribution to the loss of biodiversity. And they have rightly pointed out from those diverse scientific community those issues. But what about the answers? And can the scientific community from climate change and biodiversity actually come up with the answers? And I would say the answer needs to come from the scientific community on agri and food. And what we say there, as so aptly pointed out by Paul in his presentation, is a rat race for adjectives. It's not at all coordinated, or it can be much more coordinated. And why would you want such a voice? If you go to climate change conventions, which I do, is the outstanding and above discussion impact of papers produced by IPCC. We don't have that sort of papers with that standing within the agri-food scientific community. And we do need that. We do need it. And I'm saying we as the agri-food community, but also, as pointed out also by Christoph, the decision makers, be it at the national level or the regional level, because there's a lot of regional issues playing, but also at the international level. If we go to the Food Systems Summit, we need to make sure that the scientific community in the agri-food arena is able to come up with a coordinated answer to the questions posed regarding climate change, regarding food security, regarding biodiversity loss. Only then can policymakers really make their difficult choices. Thanks.
Thanks, Marcel. Really, really important points there. We need more coordination from the science community on the answers and the solutions to these really complex issues. Coming to Chris now. Chris, you're working with farmers in many different African countries. What would you like to see in terms of evidence informing policies on adaptation and agriculture? Do we still have Chris, or have we got a connection problem? Chris, are you there?
Okay.
Hi,
can you hear me?
Yeah, I think we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and hello, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak this. It's turning into evening here in Uganda. Yes, I work with an NGO called Africa 2000 Network Uganda, and we are members of also another semi-continental-wide network of CSOs called Participatory Ecological Land Use Management. So through that, we have a presence in 13 African countries. Within Uganda, we work with 3 million farmers annually, promoting sustainable land use management and specifically focusing on agroecology. Now, working with farmers, especially smallholder farmers and a few medium level farmers, the evidence that should inform policy from the farmer's point of view is one where the farmers have been involved. They're actually in the lead because they know their problems better. Many times scientists come where I am as a research and innovation user, but also as somebody who takes these innovations to the farmers. Farmers keep, they tend to pick what they have been involved in developing much more. We have a project in Bududa, in one of the slip slopes in Uganda. There's a lot of landslides. We are doing integrated farm planning with them, also called the PIP. People from Wageningen know it better. Farmers are part of it, scientists are involved, so they are coming up with evidence which we are already marketing to the policymakers at local government level, but also at national government level. So ministries, departments, government agencies are involved in generating that evidence. So it's straight away leaking into policies at national level, but also at local government level. The evidence should also be multi-sectoral, as Paul mentioned, because many times we have a tendency to focus on one thing. And yet, Paul mentioned it, Mason mentioned it, it's a multiplicity of causes that leads to reduction in biodiversity and affecting the ecosystems from delivering their much desired services. So the technological, environmental planning should be multi-sectoral. The evidence then should also be disaggregated. It should be taking care of communities and societies that are excluded. So we have policies that are not looking at justice. We have policies that are not including people who are most vulnerable to the climate change and other effects. So women, youth, elderly. It's important that the evidence that's generated through innovation takes care of their needs. But also the evidence should involve nurturing of the farmer's ability and intellect to come up with innovations, but also use innovations. We want to wait for all the farmers. And what about if you also involve the young farmers, students, children in school, to be innovative, to reflect on what they are doing, reflect on the environment, reflect on the food systems that they are benefiting from at an age. So as they become practitioners of agriculture, they can write out on their own, pick innovations and see how to fund them. The evidence also should inform the private sector, because what happens in Africa, policies are written, very nice policies, but the funding and other facilitation to get those innovations up and rolling and benefiting the majority is not there. It doesn't come through. We had a project in northern Uganda on cassava, bringing very good varieties of cassava, drought tolerant, quick maturity. They don't need a lot of fertility in the soil. They produce the cassava. The pool side was not coming through because you needed not to process the cassava. So innovations, however good they are, if they don't take into consideration some of those value chain interests of the different stakeholders, then it doesn't inform policy, and a good policy at that. I thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. Great points there. Great that you brought in the private sector at the end. That's absolutely critical. But also your points about inclusive approaches and disaggregating the data that we have and partnerships between farmers and scientists. I think really important. Thanks for that. Great. Well, we've got just time for a very quick another round with our panelists, but do keep your interventions quite short because we're running a little bit late. Coming back to you, Christoph, one of the challenges I think in agriculture research is fragmentation of efforts. How can we address this better, both as funders and in terms of the institutions that we support?
Yeah, thank you, Rasha. So clearly an issue, fragmentation of efforts. I think responsibilities on many sides, from the funders certainly, but also from partner countries and institutions and themselves. And the issue is really how we can find ways to better connect these two entities. And for me, there is one point which has to come first and foremost, is the quality of the policy dialogue that we can establish with the countries ourselves. This is the only way that there is full ownership of the research agenda and what research can contribute to innovation and change in farming systems and food systems in these countries. And linked to that, some forms of responsibility on funder sides to be engaged in capacity development and resources for the institution in these countries, but also countries themselves committing resources and capacities there. So it has to be articulated at different levels from the international level, and there was the reference to the UN Food System Summit and how it has to be also backed by increased use of science and knowledge that we have in other international arena. The continental level, we have, for instance, on our side, established formal dialogue with the African Union on joint priorities for research and joint mobilization of resources, and also regional level and national level. Second point that I want to make, it's clearly research that has to tackle local needs. And somehow I think there is a need to look at how we can better involve research capacities in more formal dialogue on sector dialogues, and not have it as something aside, the dialogues that we can have in any countries on agricultural development and food system transformation. The research capacity should be part of this dialogue so that they can also look at how they can better target needs expressed by the sector itself. Last point that I want to make to respect the time constraint we are facing, and it's to insist on what I said. We need there, of course, an international research network that is conducive, and I'm sure that Marco Ferroni will develop about that, but the one CGIAR reform is an important one, and the capacities that it can bring will be important for the countries. It is also important in that context that we bring a research agenda that is as comprehensive as possible, and that is open to look at complexity of issues that I mentioned, and not to isolate issues. This is very important for us, and I think what I heard from other speakers. And linked to that, what I said earlier, this complexity is essential to help policymakers and partners to make the right choices, or at least the choice that they can make. Thank you.
Thanks, Christophe. Moving very quickly on to Tembe, very aware that we're short of time. Tembe, political economy, we know that's a huge constraint that plays into the way in which evidence is used. How can we ensure it doesn't become a barrier to uptake of evidence?
Okay, thanks, Rachel. I think we have to understand that policy decisions depend on more than science and on more than just what we would term the technical. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, the information that's provided by policy-focused research is invaluable. But my point is that there's need to also understand and appreciate the political economy. We need to appreciate the actors, or rather the stakeholders, and the power relationships between them and the institutional framework within which these actors operate and through which they interact. So it is important that the food systems research that partners like CCAFs are very good at producing. They need to directly address decision makers' questions, and the results should be produced to coincide with decision points. I know that scientists are fond of, long-term research studies, but what the science community needs to understand is that you do not have the luxury of time when it comes to informing decision making. Policy decisions can be made overnight, and honestly, no policymaker has time to wait for results from a panel study that will take years when people are calling for change and are demonstrating every Friday outside their offices. I think we all remember Greta's Friday for Future demonstration, and that took the world by storm and put pressure on leaders to act. So there is no luxury of time when it comes to making important policy decisions. Decisions will be made, including decisions to do nothing. So whether the science is ready or is not ready, decisions will be made. So yes, researchers would want to innovate research yields, but in doing so, make sure that you produce a research agenda that identifies and prioritizes policy stakeholders' key knowledge gaps. And you need to engage the policy stakeholders throughout the research process to ensure timeliness and relevance of research results.
Thanks, Tembe, for those very strong messages to researchers and the research community. Marcel, what are your thoughts on that? What should we do to ensure that decisions are evidence-based?
Well, what can you say after Tembe? She's been quite vocal and quite apt. I mean, if you're the frog in the boiling pot, you don't want to know the exact temperature at which you're going to fry. You want to be told to jump. And that is the thing that science needs to come up to. That's the relevance for science that Tabby points out. And yes, policy makers will make decisions based on a whole lot of issues. They need to balance energy with agriculture, with transport. So they will sometimes disregard evidence that is being put in front of them. But if the evidence is clear, then policymakers can make that decision and even explain why they are balancing the part of evidence coming from the agricultural community with energy. And they can explain to the people the basis on which they make their difficult decisions. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcel. Brilliant. Chris, coming to you just to close off this part of the panel discussion. We're entering a year with 3 big summits, the Food System Summit, Biodiversity, Climate Change, all of them with a focus on action and innovation. What would you like to see as an ideal outcome from the perspective of the farmer?
Thank you, Rachel. One is a better coordination of effort. Already we have the 3 summits, maybe because the operation it will be so big, but biodiversity, food systems, and climate change, for me, one leads into the other. So we need to coordinate better, and also to do more communication, effective communication. We hope messages will come out of there, but also we need to increase investment in human resource, investment in research and development, more human resource, more money going into research and innovation that is relevant to farmers. That's really, and then the policymakers, would you kindly in those summits hold them accountable? They come, they pick the information, they come back, they make very good policies, but which they fully know, much as Marcel is saying, they make difficult decisions. Some are not necessarily difficult, but they are just meant to keep them in their political positions with disregard to the farmers, needs of the farmers. So I would like to hear more pressure put on them. You've come up with these policies, please budget for them. Let's get human resource, let's get extension workers, let's get the people around the farmer to help them use this innovation. It's pointless funding research, and the research is in National Agriculture Systems archives. Thank you, in the interest of time.
Thanks, Chris. Really clear messages there for us all. Thank you for that. I'm going to come to Eunice now, Eunice Lekoko. I'd like to invite Eunice to share your reflections, Eunice, from a youth perspective. What do you think we might be missing from this debate?
Thank you very much. And it's very interesting to hear all the different perspectives from the different panel members, and I mean, very useful lessons and reflections from the different stakeholders. These are some of the things that we grapple with at the Wageningen Center for Development Innovation, where I'm based, but also more so on my research, which really focuses on small-scale informal entrepreneurs who are based on different places in the production value chain, and how they use this, the smallholder actors really transition and try to improve their businesses, because many of them operate in very disadvantageous agroeconomic conditions. And so I focus a lot on inclusion, exclusion debates, empowerment, what does it mean? And then of course, largely on the contextual relevance of development actions that we do. So linking to this discussion today, it's interesting to see that we all have, we all are raising different parts of the questions that are there, situated in the different parts of the food system. And one of the things that directly touches onto my work as a younger researcher is that there's need to constantly unpack this idea of intervention that we have, whether in terms of climate change, whether we are approaching it from a biodiversity angle, whether we are approaching it from a purely, time and evolution and the effects that come up from it. But we really need to continuously interrogate and unpack the idea of intervention and what we consider to be relevant in order to continuously adapt it and ensure that we are not enabling adverse development. The second thing that I think that directly ties to my study and just my research is the recognition that there's a lot of different interests and the effects of climate change as a whole affect different pockets of the population differently. And of course, even the stakeholders who are engaged in finding the solutions attack it from different angles. So we all emphasize different aspects of it. However, from whichever angle this dialogue is held, more often than not, we find that policy solutions and interventions really assume a sense of uniformity and homogeneity in the population. Therefore, we miss out on the different characteristics, ambitions, and capabilities that the populations that you're trying to address bring to the table. And so this is one of the things that I really think needs to be highlighted. And while we appreciate the challenge that national level and global level policy has to address the unique needs of different communities, we also do not need to totally ignore it and have this unanimous, homogeneous approach. And thirdly, I think directly linked to my study is this idea that interventions, oftentimes, when we think of our reflections, we always bring the discussion down to the GDP and this idea of economic aspects. How does it impact the economy? Who is, below the poverty line, and who then, is able to respond appropriately or inappropriately to climate change? And yet we ignore these other elements of things like participation and voice, and who exactly is able to really input into this dialogue on environmental sustainability that comes along with climate change. And therefore, I think even from the discussion today, a lot of very useful points have been said, but I think some of the, in light of the idea of complexity and trade-offs that we've had, I think one of the things that I would like to see more of is reflections that go beyond this idea of economic parameters and the GDP, like we've talked about in the past, but more so to capture this overall well-being in a way that is appreciates the differentiations that, Chris has just talked about the marginalized and the people who are, not really the vulnerable. I think that's the term he used. But then when it comes to the most vulnerable, and I think Paul also in his discussions in the conclusion, he talked about the need to pay attention to this. But this, we often have, at the policy level space, we often have very good connections between the global, the national, and the regional, continental type of approaches. However, we really oftentimes, of course, really miss out on the community level integration. And yet we really know that when it comes to the African context, for example, it's the poor who really heavily rely on the biodiversity and the ecology to really, generate income for their nutrition needs. And even as we have this whole dialogue of making sure that we end up in a place where we are secure food-wise, it's imperative that we have these reflections that go beyond the national level and really have a place for this connection with the different unique needs that come up with the different communities and contexts that are there. And then when we also look at the most vulnerable, I think there needs to be this national level adaptation, that even when we are committed to policies and we have, and I think Tembi was also alluding to this just now, even when we've committed to policy and we put them across, we really need an inbuilt mechanism. And unfortunately, this becomes difficult in this economy where we have, projects that are time bound. It becomes difficult to have an inbuilt mechanism that constantly monitors to see whether the proposed solutions are working and how can we keep adapting them so that then those who are excluded, for example, in terms of, like solutions that are there for climate change for local communities, they're some of the basic requirements. And oftentimes you find that, the extreme poor who are maybe very smallholder farmers are not able to access this. And yet, because we are time bound and because we are really going on with the motion, then it's difficult to include them. And so this becomes a challenge. The other thing I think is also there's need, this paying attention to this, the poverty gap that sort of disallows some people to engage with the solutions that are proposed for climate change, is a need to put, this connection and to highlight the relevance and the connections between, evidence in this context that are really riddled with a lot of poverty. Because I think a lot of climate change solutions that have evidence that are attached to it oftentimes are linked to not the extreme poor, maybe marginalized in one way or the other, but then there's a lacking connection between how this policy really, really works for the extreme poor and how then it can, in the long term and short term, or mid-term, be able to really provide realistic solutions for the context of the extreme poor. And lastly, I think for the African context, one of the things that I really would like to hear more of is the evidence of making sure that policies are, adapting, and when we're focusing on agriculture, we really, really need to make sure that the informality that is highly prevalent among smallholder farmers finds a way to be inculcated in the policy world that is very formal, that is very, institutionalized. So how do we find a way to connect it to the formality? Because the informality is here, and yet, one part needs to move in order for this informality that is experienced by a lot of the people in the very marginalized communities. And in this case, I really am focusing on the extreme poor, because I think a lot of solutions that are proposed are not adaptable or possible to be adopted by the extreme poor. So this
thanks, Eunice. I think that's a great point to transition to the next stage, and a really important reminder for us to focus on those groups. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's open it now to some of the questions that we've had from the floor, or rather from the Hoover app. And we've got a number of great questions here. I'd actually like to kind of combine a couple of them. We had one here from Martin Heron. He says it seems to be a great challenge to bundle our efforts into a joint and more coordinated approach, which would probably be more targeted, make it easier for policymakers to gear their respective political environments towards this. And I think that picks up on something that I think it was Marcel maybe mentioned. It'd be good to think through, what do we think of that statement? Are there illustrative experiences here from other countries? And we had a similar question on the role of different bodies in coordinating, regional bodies in Africa, international partners to coordinate policy and action. So I'm wondering whether, Tembi, whether you want to maybe comment on that one, whether you've got any thoughts on experiences from different countries on that. And then I'll come to a question more on value chains in the private sector.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. I think a quick one from me is that the issue of coordination needs a facilitator, right, to bring all these different actors together. And I think oftentimes we don't have resources for that. We don't have resources to have someone facilitate a process. But we do have some good example, I think, out of Zambia, where issues around climate change have been taken up and are coordinated from the Ministry of Planning. So the Ministry of Planning is the one that looks at sort of broad government efforts, and they are the ones that are able to sort of pick the thread on climate change issues, coordinate with agriculture, with environment, and with other sector ministries. So I think there is need to invest more in having this one body being a facilitator. That's where I think the challenge often is. We probably do have it at a regional level, where we have the regional economic communities sort of playing that role. But often countries want to sort of be independent and move things on their own. And I think that's sometimes where the challenge comes in.
Thanks, Tembe. Sorry, I had a problem coming off mute there. Thanks for that. Let's come to Yokateme's question from Hoover. One of the key challenges for African food systems are supply chains. African food systems depend on their suppliers. Most inputs used in Africa are imported, making it hard for African farmers to adapt. How can policy adapt to support more adaptation? And maybe I can invite Paul to come back and perhaps answer that one.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a tough question because I think the conditions vary by country. I think countries are trying to manage and support incentives to their rural farmers and so forth through incentives and so forth. So that's a careful balancing between how much the national government should be involved in production of crops, etc., versus letting the market and the citizens do it on their own and so forth. And a lot of countries do spend a lot of public funds in ensuring that supplies and improved seed and so forth is provided to rural farmers and so forth. And that's likely to continue for quite a few years yet until the market economy takes over and farmers are able to stand on their own. I think there are ways to also improve productivity without relying too much on inputs. So there's a lot of progress, I think, in sort of farming methods, agroforestry methods, etc., that perhaps can help sustain productivity and ensure that there's enough food that's produced over time. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Paul. Another question come in from, I think it's Mele. Why is there no attention paid to the role of commercial agriculture in adopting and disseminating sustainable agriculture practices, as well as social protection when there's a shortage in food and nutrition? So, should we be spending more time thinking about the role of commercial agriculture as we see huge changes in the agriculture sector in many countries? I don't know who would like to pick that one up. I'm wondering, Marcel, whether you'd be interested to jump in on that one. And then I'm hoping we have time for one more question about Indigenous knowledge in climate science. And I might come to you, Chris, so just giving you a heads up there. Marcel.
Sure, Rachel, and thanks for the question. I think it is important that all relevant actors come together, and what we call the Dutch Diamond approach brings together scientific institutions, civil society, and indeed the private sector. Let's not forget that a lot of action on the ground, a lot of investment, and indeed a lot of scientific knowledge that we need and that we need to put into practice comes from the private sector. So they are a key part, both of the knowledge part, to develop innovative approaches, but also certainly in the implementations part. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcel. And I think probably our final question from the audience is probably Chris. I'm hoping you can come in on this one. How can we include Indigenous knowledge in climate science and policy? What's the role of traditional or Indigenous knowledge there, and how can we best draw on that?
Thank you, Rachel. I think there will be need for attitude change amongst our scientists, because up until recently, we've been ignoring Indigenous knowledge. Usually when you get to a community before you do research, people have information about the problem itself and how they have been addressing it. That should be the starting point. So it's our scientists who have to change and value Indigenous knowledge, build on Indigenous knowledge. And perhaps that's one reason farmers usually don't adopt the innovations you come up with, because they don't relate with them directly. So I think, yes, the farmers have the knowledge, the scientists need to recognize it, but also the policymakers need to value the information that comes from Indigenous people.
Thanks, Chris, for that. I think we're probably going to move now to the final remarks from each panelist. We've just got time to come back to each of our panelists for a final remark, but panelists, I'm going to have to ask you to be really punchy. What we want you to do is to share one key action or observation or takeaway that you would like the audience to hear. So if you can keep it really tight, that would be brilliant. So one key takeaway from everyone. So Christoph, we'll come to you first.
Thank you, and thank you again for this event. My takeaway is what Chris Paul also represented with the risk management, and how we have to look at productivity versus kind of resilience agenda of farming systems. And also building on a number of interventions, our interest to move and accompany more research on the agroecological approaches, where we think there is a big margin of knowledge, including to look at how these approaches can benefit from different forms of partnerships with private sector and also digitization. So really to look at it as an innovation itself that can benefit certainly from local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and valorizing knowledge from the main actors, the farmers. Thank you.
Thanks, Christoph. Tembe.
Thanks, Rachel. I think I went hard on the researchers earlier on, so I want to sort of soften the blow. But I think my message to researchers is that policy making in Africa is not really constrained by the lack of evidence. I think the evidence is there, but instead there is a challenge of failure of policymakers to actually use that evidence that's available. And that's because of the way the evidence comes to them. So to researchers, thank you for working so hard in making sure that we have the evidence, but make sure that it's packaged in a format that is easily understandable, that is policy relevant, that is easily accessible. And when you make recommendations, can you please be specific to the options that can be adopted? Thank you.
Thank you, Tembe. Marcel.
Well, it seems like Tembe and I are really on the same page here again. What I take home is that we really need indeed science to, a lot of solutions are already there. We need to get them to the policymakers, and we need to get the policymakers to make fair and sound decisions on them. For that, we need a science policy interface. Let's move on.
Thank you, Marcel. And finally, Chris next, and then I'll just give a last word to Paul before passing to
2 points. One, I would like to see better coordination and collaboration between researchers, scientists, farmers, and extension service providers. The second one is following up on the policies that were made, to review them, to make them better, and also to implement them and use them. Sorry? Marcel seems not to hear me. What has happened?
No, we heard you well, Chris. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much then.
Thank you. And finally, since Paul kicked off that session, do you have a takeaway for us, Paul?
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this very much. I wanted to comment on the issue of coordination and the difficulties associated with that. No one wants to be coordinated, but what we do though is we provide $3 million to NAP teams in each country to help put together teams and stakeholders to come and co-develop solutions. So hopefully this provides a way to create that space for everybody that has something to contribute to come together and help countries develop solutions. There's no expectation that government officers will develop all the solutions. Actually, they want to build on the expertise that exists in the communities, in the NGOs, and so forth. So please make yourself available to government teams and then offer your services and intelligence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thanks to all of the panelists for those thought-provoking insights over that session and for your takeaways. And thanks for helping us keep to time. We'll pass now to Marco Ferroni, who will close our session with some forward-looking perspectives on innovation in climate-resilient African food systems. Thanks, Marco, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and congratulations to you for your great chairing of this session. I want to start by thanking the Netherlands government, the Wageningen University and Research, and CCAF's CGIAR for organizing today's event and the remaining 2 webinars in the lead up to the Climate Adaptation Summit. I want to say that, and I know that my time is limited, just as everyone else's time was among the previous speakers, but the discussion that I have now been able to listen to, that I have been treated to, if you wish, has clearly raised searching questions for researchers and research managers on how to visualize our work as researchers as part of broader processes of agri-food systems transformations. You have identified the need for voice, in other words, listening to users' needs. I think that is central as one identifies research designs, taking on board contributions of partners, working with the private sector, with farmers, with governments, with civil society, and as one of the speakers have mentioned, communicating those research results and evidence built on the basis of research in ways that make sense and can be used by policymakers, for example. Colleagues, in my lifetime, there have been unprecedented technological and institutional innovations in agri-food systems, and they have brought major gains in human welfare the world over. We are now, however, at a turning point because many aspects of those gains are also turning out to be unsustainable in the longer run, and even today. And the issues that really have to do with this turning point are in the realm of natural resources, including land, water, and biodiversity degradation challenges, temperature rises and extremes of weather, problems related to nutrition and public health arising from the ways our agri-food systems function, and similarly, agri-food systems related problems of inequity, social and related to gender, for example, as well as employment and livelihood challenges that keep a large part of humanity from being able to prosper and live up to potential. These dimensions interact. And you have mentioned this, many of you have pointed to aspects of these interactions, and they need therefore to be looked at together. And that, of course, creates sizable cognitive problems, even in terms of delimiting systems in ways that are actionable, not only from a research perspective, but obviously also from an action and from a policy making in particular perspective. We have also seen, and some of you have referred to this, that the current pandemic, as well as other shocks, have thrown up weaknesses of resilience when it comes to our world's agri-food systems, heterogeneous as they are. And it is clear that there cannot be meaningful responses to shocks without recognizing that everything is interconnected. It is difficult to deal in such a situation with the issue of scale, and our discussion has also shown this. We tend to revert, and I don't think anybody has mentioned this, but we tend to revert to the comfort of projects and their relatively narrow boundaries, oftentimes in the face of complexities. And projects, as we know, can work well as long as they remain funded, but typically they don't scale because the reality around them is messier than what the project's laboratory can control. We therefore need an agri-food systems innovation reset, and this panel, this whole discussion has been all about this, in order to be able to engender change at scale. And this is the consensus of the research and policy making community working to prepare the signature events that we will be going into this year, starting with the Climate Adaptation Summit a few weeks from now. This is also the consensus of key statements. I have just read the Cornell Atkinson Center Agri-Food Systems Transformation Report, which makes many of the points that have been raised here. And then, of course, we have the CCAF's CGIAR report on actions to transform food systems under climate change, with its envelope of actions in different domains that resonate and have been reconfirmed in a way, if you wish, by the discussion we just had. And we have the CGIAR Research and Innovation Strategy to 2030 that was just published and approved by our founders about a month ago. The goods that a reset of agri-food systems innovation are expected to deliver at scale are very clear, colleagues. It is about stopping the widening of the land, water, and biodiversity footprint of food. It is about decoupling food demand growth from land and water use and so on. And this has implications for the need to close yield gaps, shift to alternative sources of protein, cut food losses and waste by half, and so on. And it is about delivering for people. And this has a nutrition, a balanced diet, a health, and a livelihoods dimension. If we look at things in this way, it is easy to see that portfolios of disconnected projects, whether they be research-based or operational, are unlikely to deliver. We need instead to shift to a systems view and indeed into mission mode at relevant geographical scales. And the geographical scales have been represented in the discussion that we have just witnessed. We need to identify systems and coordinated action on systems components working across disciplines and in partnership with stakeholders and actors that are relevant to the particular problem to be addressed. Technological and engineering breakthroughs are necessary. There is huge scope and opportunity for them. There is a fascinating pipeline of technologies present. There are lots of technologies, as some of you have pointed out, that are already there, that could be adopted or deployed, but for reasons that are sometimes the object of research have not this hasn't happened so far. However, it is very important for us to notice, and this has also been mentioned by some of you, but it clearly, I don't think, has received enough attention in the discussion so far, that the challenging problem is not science and technology, it is in collective action. And therefore, collective action, of course, with its requirement for leadership, political will, willingness and ability to find cooperative solutions, and also the ability to manage unintended consequences and dissent. And I think that that's a huge area of research in which, of course, there is literature, there's a lot of insight, there are Nobel Prizes that have been given about aspects of what I'm talking about here. But when it comes to agri-food systems transformations, I think that we need a reset in terms of looking at the collective action and the leadership issues that are in demand. Now, on innovation is about more than scientific research, and I think that this has come out clearly from the discussion that we have heard. But the scientific research is always necessary, and it is always playing a key role. Innovation, as I see it, is about combination, really. And by combination, I mean the calling together in innovation ecosystems of the different contributions needed to develop and take to the market products, services, and process design mechanisms that are capable of rearranging the world, as it were, in beneficial ways. Partnership, again, is fundamental to this, as is the freedom to be creative in a culture of openness that encourages cooperation, unencumbered by bureaucratic constraints, excessive risk aversion, and rent seeking. It is necessary that there be a focus on client needs, that the listening and working with users that we've already talked about, blending science and change management. It's typically not just science, it's change management. In other words, it's the institutional aspects, it's the political economy aspects, and so on. And it is very much, and we've heard this from our farmer representative, referred to about the need to address the human factors and constraints that drive adoption, including, for example, de-risking adoption. CGIAR is the world's largest international public agricultural or agri-food systems research organization. We have about 10,000 staff operating in 100 countries, and we are currently transitioning through a change process to address exactly the themes that have arisen in the discussion that we have just witnessed. It is a change process to integrate capabilities for a new era of interconnected, partnership-driven research and innovation, where strong country relationships are of the essence. We have shown it is possible to catalyze transformational change in agri-food systems before, and we can collectively do it again if we reflect and apply the lessons from our discussion, if we approach things in a coordinated, connected, demand-driven, comprehensive, and partnership-based way. Based way. I need a drink of water soon. And this is what we're promising to do, working together with all of you. I want to thank, therefore, again, the participants and the contributors to our extremely useful discussion just now. And I think that this would close our session, but not before referring to the next session. We have a panel or webinar number 2 in this series that is coming up. The title is Digitization to Improve Planning and Monitoring of Adaptation Actions. And this takes place 2 days from now on January 15. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a good rest of the day.